Hello, I'm Ross Parry. I'm from the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester in the UK, and I have to say it's a real delight and it's a real privilege to be invited to contribute to the brilliant, innovative Shed Talks, pushing all of our ideas around museums, around education, technology, innovation, all of those things that those TED Talks do, but with a particular spin that's right for our region, our sector, but it's also right for now because we're all opening up in slightly different ways. So the idea of having a talk like this morning, this afternoon, that's honest, that's personal, that's frankly improvised, is indicative of what we've become this year. And this gets to the heart of what I'd like to talk about, which is an emotional turn in museum technology. That seems an odd thing to say, doesn't it? It's about how we've changed the way this year that we speak to each other and we think about technology and digital in the context of the museum. We've all been through a lot. We continue to be going through a lot, personally, professionally, as a sector, as a society. And if you're like me, you've probably found that you're having very different conversations, not just with the people you love and your family and friends and your social circle, but with your colleagues, with the people at work, with the professionals in your sector. It's as if we've given ourselves permission to start talking about how we feel. It's as if we've learned a whole new vocabulary about well-being, about mindfulness, about, let's be honest, being scared and being worried about whether we'll have a job or whether there'll still be a museum. And even that thought that in all the change that we've seen over the decades, different government policies, different funding models, different strategies for our institutions, the ways that our own career paths zigzag in so many places, we always thought, didn't we, that whatever happens, the museum will be there. That'll be like a rock. That'll be like a lighthouse. Policies will change. Expectations around what we collect will change. Our approach to design and communication will change. Even the people who come through our door, the profile of that audience will change. And in some ways, that's what excites us about the museum and being part of the museum sector. But we always assumed that there'd always be a museum. And for the first time in most of our lives, we're actually now wondering whether that museum will still be there. That rock, that absolute strong foundation is now being questioned as well. And that's unbearably hard. That presents us personally, when we associate so much of our own personal identity with our professional identity, becomes difficult to accept. And as a sector, as a profession, as an industry, that's existentially difficult, that we may not have all the museums that we have now. Faced with that, faced with questions around our own care and safety and health, to say that these times are uncertain is an understatement. It feels like a euphemism. We're starting to find other words around precarity that perhaps go to the heart of how precarious everything feels right now. One of many consequences of that uncertainty and that precarity is that we've reframed the way that we think about and talk about our professional practice. And technology and digital is not outside of this. So as we've all opened up to each other and started to ask each other how we're doing and how we're feeling, and as we've started to have very different conversations with line managers and people around us about their own role, and as we've had quite profound strategic discussions about the future of our organization, we've also reframed the way that we talk about technology. We've found a new way of talking about digital. And this is what we're starting to call an emotional turn in museum technology. And it represents a new vocabulary, a new set of assumptions, a new sort of theoretical mindset, different things that might inform how we talk about digital and technology in the museum. But excitingly and importantly, I think it's also having a consequence for who has a voice and whose voice is now being heard when we talk about digital and technology. And that's what I'd like to talk a little bit more about in this talk. Turn, emotional turn. Turn is such a strange word, isn't it? And it's a slightly pretentious word as well, isn't it? It seems very kind of arch and kind of informed and mannered and academic. But it's that word we use in the academy to really just say that we're looking in a new direction. There's been a turn in the direction of scholarship. So rather than just head down and working and asking the same questions with the same methods, with the same theoretical tools and the same conventions of writing, actually our subject has gone through a little bit of a revolution, and actually we're now thinking in a different direction. In my subject, in museum studies, museology, we've actually gone through a few of these turns over the last sort of 50 years. Through the 80s, we went through an educational turn, a learning turn into the 90s, where we suddenly saw the museum non-negotiably as a place of learning. And we talked about the educational role of the museum. And that became the beginning and the end of all we did in the museum. And it influenced the type of writing that was taking place at that time. And it influenced the fundamental building blocks of museum studies. It was almost as if it was a subject about learning and education. There's been a social turn at the beginning of the 21st century, the social turn in museum studies, about thinking about social inclusion, thinking about access, thinking about participation, democracy, thinking about social justice. This was the turn in our subject that found a confidence and a complete erudition, and was so articulate in conveying that a museum has a social role, that museums have a social responsibility. And we turn the spotlight on ourselves to think, are we representative of society? Are our collections representative of society? Can everyone feel like they feel safe and they belong and they're represented in this institution? That was that social turn. Museum studies and the academy more widely has also gone through a sensory turn. This idea of starting to think about stripping away media and interpretation and all those programming and all of that kind of communication that sits around museum work, and just looking to the very heart of what is it to be a person with a body in a museum space? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? What's the temperature? What can I see? What can I feel? What's it like to pick up that object? What's the weight of it? What's the friction in my hands? What does it remind me of? What's my sensation? Am I excited? Am I scared? Am I happy? Have I gone through multiple emotions just in this 40 minutes of this visit? The sensory turn in museum studies was all about starting to think about being present, that corporeal, embodied sensory experience of the museum. So that word turn gets used a lot, and I'm sure there are many more turns ahead of us. And actually, even in my area of museum technology, we went through our own turn. We turned to theory about 20 years ago. We were a subject that was very practical and technical, quite right, where there was so much we needed to figure out. And then about 2 decades ago, we started to write about technology in a more intellectualized way, in a more theoretical way. We wanted to understand it in a sociological way, or we wanted to understand it in terms of, media and representation and authenticity and so many other things. So there's been many different turns within our subject. So the emotional turn is one where I think we are noticing something that we forgot to do over the last 40, 50 years of bringing technology into the museum. If we see that first computer being wheeled into galleries in sort of the mid-19 to late 1960s, it's a long journey we've been on, half a century of using this technology. We probably spent 30 years getting the technology right. We had to make sure those cables and codes all worked. We were very focused on projects that demonstrated things, that the evidence that we were doing the right thing. It was about procurement. It was about making sure we get the right hardware, the right software. How do we just make these machines work? Do they belong in the museum? If so, where? Are they about records management and collection management and documentation? Or should we have one of these computers in a gallery? Can we put it in a gallery? Should visitors be allowed to use it? Can it go in an art gallery next to an artwork? Or can it be in a science center? And does it have a different role in each? And what about mobile? You know, what if a visitor's bringing their own technology in? And what about the web? What should we put on a website? Is it different to what we show in a gallery space? Do we run it like a publication as opposed to a one-off show? We've spent so much time over those first 30 years of museum technology just understanding what digital was. We then spent probably, what, 15 years? The last 15 years, with confidence, now that we knew that the technology worked, now that we were excited about what digital could do, what the network could do for the museum, we've spent the last decade trying to get the business processes right. Technology's here now. It's here in the world. It's here in the lives of our audiences. Many bring technology with them to the museum. They expect to see technology, digital technology, as an innate part of any exhibition, you know, display case, pedestal, label, screen. It's become a function of exhibition. So it's there in the world, it's there in the lives of our audience, it's there in their expectations of what they encounter in the museum. And frankly, it's in the lives of us as practitioners as well. It's the tool that we use to talk to each other, to have shed talks, to send emails, to get projects done, to build content. So we've spent the last 10 years or so really understanding how to do digital. Now we know what digital is, and now we can make it work, and we can connect things, and we can digitize collections, and we know how to build interactives, and we know how to do things well. How can we now run that effectively within our institution? We've spent this decade thinking about digital strategy. What is it to have a digital strategy? What is it to know where digital sits in your institution? Who has responsibility for it? How we build processes, and how we build decision making, and how we build systems to make sure that digital is part of, you know, the day-to-day running of our institution, but it's part of what we output as well. And we've become really good at understanding what digital means in the context of the museum. We know it's something we use. We know that it's a set of tools. We know that digital is also a set of processes. It's something we manage, it's systems, which is different from a tool. But we also know that digital in the museum sector is something we create. We make digital things. We make films, we make websites, we make apps and games and interactives, but we also make digital records and amass digital data, and we create digital surrogates of our objects, or we might even collect digital things. So something we use, something we manage, something we create. But digital for the museum sector, as a sector that's so aware of its place in the world and place in society, digital is also something we understand. We understand digital culture. We think about digital ethics, digital authenticity, what it is to live and have an identity in a digital world, in a network world. So we've become really good at that. We've become really good at starting to understand what digital means in the museum, and that understanding also that digital for each museum is going to be different. The small volunteer-run institution is different from the Smithsonian Institution. The institute that's about digital art is different from the institution that's about archaeology. They are different in size, different in governance, different in their where they are on their digital journey. So we know now that there isn't just one single relationship that all museums have with digital. We know that each of us will decide what's important in terms of using, managing, creating, and understanding digital. We will know where digital is in our organization and what we need to do to grow with digital. We've been figuring that out. 30 years of making the technology work, 10, 15 years of understanding the strategy and the processes and the management. And there was one thing we forgot to do. There was one part of that classic triangle of technology, processes, that last bit that we forgot to do. And that's people. It's us. We were so good at focusing on the technology, getting the engineering right, getting the processes right, we probably forgot that it's human beings, it's people, it's individuals, it's you that actually makes digital work in the museum. And that's what we're turning to now. That's our emotional turn within museum technology and digital. This year has made us pause and notice it because of those conversations, because of those new discussions that we've been having, those new words that we've learned to say, that new humility, that new opening up and trust that we've had to develop over these last 6-9 months. We've actually started to find other ways of talking about technology as well. It's interesting because we already had that skill set. We already had that muscle group. You know, we're museums, we think really hard about our audiences, understanding the needs of our audiences, whether they're in the museum or in the community, what their specific learning needs are, whether they feel disenfranchised and we need to reach out in different ways, understanding different communities of interest, understanding preferred learning styles, understanding how diverse and brilliantly varied our audiences are, how they may want to interact with our museum in different ways, that they have different levels of expertise and they have authority and expertise themselves. All of those things that we're so good at. We have such brilliant emotional intelligence as a sector in understanding our audience. We're ready to listen, we're ready to pause, and we always want our audiences to be at the center of everything we do. We're so good at doing that. We also, within technology, have actually been thinking about people all along. Right at the very beginning, when technology came into the museum in the 60s and 70s and 80s, if you go back and have a look at some of those manuals, they do refer to people, they do refer to the worker using the computer, but very much as a sort of, as an operator, that the person is anonymous and they're part of the system. Then through the 80s and 90s, what happens is that we still talk about the museum person, the worker, and technology. And we start to notice that that person is actually an individual in the world and they're outside of the system. They're not just an anonymous operator. So this person is now an individual. And through the 90s, we focused so much more, didn't we? Not just on function and operation of the computer, but on personalization and accessibility and wanting to make sure that our interfaces for staff and visitors worked for your particular needs. What's happening at the moment is that we're now starting to notice that that person isn't just part of the system as an operator. They're not an individual outside of the system with their own identity and needs, but actually that person is in the world and the system is one tiny, tiny part of their experience. What we're looking at now is not a whole load of practice and discussion around function and efficiency or on accessibility and interface, but now we're interested in activism and agency. It's not about how do I use that technology. It's not about the user, but now it's about being useful. So our own journey over the last 50 years has been one in the museum more generally, where we've thought more and more about people. And our journey around technology has been one from use to user to useful, from function and operation, an operator to individual and person to actant and someone in the world. We've already been on this journey of thinking in a more human-centered way. What's changed in this year, I think, and where we're going next, is that will become the focus. We're going to be thinking even more about the individual that's at the heart of all that we do with digital. One of the things we're doing on our 1x1 project, as it continues nationally and internationally, we're currently working in the US with the Smithsonian Institution, bringing the American Alliance of Museums in partnership for the first time with our own Museums Association, bringing the US Museum Computer Network in partnership with the Museum Computer Group in the UK, bringing 4 museums of the Smithsonian, working with National Museum Wales, National Museum Scotland, the V&A, and the Science Museum. What we're doing on that project is we're understanding the capabilities that we need as leaders and workers in the museums to lead digital, to work with digital in a more humane way. We're thinking about the emotional dimension, the affective dimension of working with technology. So to kind of bring this together, it's going to be words like care. It's going to be words like mindfulness, empathy, being resilient, thinking about precarity, thinking about emotional labor, thinking about the agency you have, thinking about the courage that you might need to work with digital. Those are the questions next for us within our sector. And a final remark, it's also going to be about the equity as well as a year of disruption where we've looked at ourselves and seen each other's vulnerabilities. We've also this year had in stark relief played out in front of us questions around cultural identity, around race, around gender, around equity and equality, around rights. That's also going to shape next our discussions around museum technology. Who's not in the room when we're putting that strategy together? Who's not in the room when we're designing that interface? Whose voice is not being heard when we talk about museum technology? This week, I had a meeting with somebody from Microsoft who sits on our advisory board for our 1x1 project, the amazing Catherine Devine. She looks over museums and their relationship and Microsoft's relationship with museums. And she said, what's the biggest thing you've learned from this project so far, thinking about museums and technology in 1x1? And it was funny because the word I used is the word that's so important for this conference and for this group. The thing we need to do is to collaborate. We need to keep supporting each other and being open and trusting so that we can figure these things out together around museums and technology. That word, that thing that we need to keep doing as we think about the emotional turn in museums and technology is we need to share. Thank you.